Hi, everybody.
Hi, Eric.
Hi, Eric.
Hi, Shana.
Hi, Eric.
I'm unmuting you, Shana.
Hi.
Oh, I can't.
Hi.
There you are. Okay. Oh, wow. Hey, Gus.
Hey.
Welcome, everybody. Oh, perfect. Gus, since I unmuted you, you can hear me fine? I can hear you. Okay, great.
Hey, Lana. Scott.
How does this all work? Are we okay? I'm in speaker view. If I switch it to gallery view, does that?
Mm-hmm.
I think so, yes.
We'll wait a couple more minutes. It's exactly the start now, but then we'll get going. I can see already that this is going to be like pop conference times 10. I see 1 million people. I would like to just immediately go, hi.
Eric, are you going to record this?
Yeah. Zoom records automatically when I put the setting in that way.
Okay.
Then the thing I don't know how to do is how to transfer it to a place like YouTube if it's super long. Plus, I have to make sure that Gus and Shana are okay with actually having it be up. So with those provisos, gonna try. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Cool. I'm gonna kick things off. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Popular Music Books in Process series. So happy we have a nice, robust attendance on our inaugural event and 2 great speakers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time setting things up. Couple of things. The idea here was authors can't do in stores. We're all desperate to see our friends at conferences. People writing books need to be reassured that people want to read them. For all those reasons, it seemed like a good thing to do this. Also, it was a chance to let different kinds of groups get involved together. The Journal of Popular Music Studies, Gus and Shana's conversation today will be part of our field notes section, where we encourage writers to comment on things that are developing in the field. So in this case, new approaches to musical biography. The pop conference, I asked from the US, I've always wanted them to work together. And I feel like at this moment, more than ever, it's really important that that happen. In that spirit, 2 people who I hope you can see, Carl Wilson and Kimberly Mack, Kim Mack, both helped very much in organizing this, and I want to thank them. Carl technically on behalf of the pop conference, Kim technically on behalf of Ask Me Us, but we all do a million things, and that's the point. And in different weeks, they'll host. Today, Carl's going to be sort of checking out the chats and helping steer the Q&A afterwards. We'll rotate that as it goes. The only other note I'll make is this is intentionally a kind of off-the-cuff presentation. It's the only way I know how to do things anyway. But every week, it's up to the presenters to kind of shape this the way they feel comfortable shaping it. It's their space. The only thing I'll try to ask for is to always have room for Q&A at the end, because I think that we want to hear from people. So with that started, let me just thank once again Shana Redmond, author of the book Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, out earlier this year on Duke Press, professor of musicology and African American studies at UCLA, in conversation with Gustavus. But for today, can we just go with Gus?
Go with Gus.
Okay, go with God, go with Gus. Author of the forthcoming in October, Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life, out on Beacon Press, professor of English at Haverford College. Why don't the 2 of you take it away, please?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Shana, do you want me to start?
Sure. Sounds good to me.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Eric and Carl and Kimberly for organizing this. And, you know, I think also just even a broader thanks in the spirit of this event to so many audiences at PopCon. I think I gave maybe 3 papers based on this material over like the last 8 years or so, 7 years. So and then I started to get worried I'd be just known as that Woody Guthrie guy, and I stopped. But it's been an incredibly nurturing space, and I think that's true for a lot of people here. So it's really good to be back virtually with you all. So we're going to actually introduce each other's books and actually read a little bit of each other's books to get things started. So I'm honored to share this virtual space with Professor Shana Redmond, whose book, Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, is truly remarkable, a work of aesthetic and conceptual experimentation as much as scholarly criticism or biography. Accordingly, Everything Man strays much farther from the conventions of biography than my book. It's really more its own genre, deftly organized around a series of concepts or epistemological figures: vibration, hologram, play, installation, environment, and frequency. And these figures in turn organize a depiction of Robeson, not so much the man as the effect, guiding us on a journey that leads from the mining communities of Wales to the sonic reverberations of the sabo tree and many places in between. Everything Man is a book less of narrative than of lush immersion, of enchantment, or at least that's the way I felt while reading it, and I'm curious to hear more about how it felt to write. Shana returns again to the capital V voice as the crucial figure for Robeson's Black presence, whether his body was present or not. And throughout, I heard the book's prose not so much as accompaniment as loving, unifying harmony. And then should I go ahead and read a little bit, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's start just by giving folks a sense of what
Okay.
it might sound like each of our projects.
To understand Paul Robeson, one must begin with sound. Described in the 1940s as democracy's greatest voice, his was a method of great intrigue and capacity. He was the only man in the world who could turn a concert into a rally for the rights of minority groups. And it was in recognition of this power that he perfected his vocal technology. And this is a quote from Robeson. God gave me the voice that people want to hear, whether in song or in speech. I shall take my voice wherever there are those who want to hear the melody of freedom or the words that might inspire hope and courage in the face of despair and fear. The travels of his voice through concerts, rallies, and recordings alike spoke to communities in all reaches of the globe. It started in dramatic fashion at home. And then Shana includes a really lovely poem by B. Richards, which I'm going to pass over. His singing on concert stages and wax was public, but its ability to perforate the divisions between performer and listener made it exceptionally intimate. As Richards argues, he spoke for them, through them, as they labored for poverty wages or sought their own tones and beliefs. His songs became their tune and light, namely those spirituals of sustenance and faith, and in the process, those who sang imagined their own justice in situated locales of intense vulnerability. Sometimes he inhabited them, forcing their voices out with his words. At other times, their voices were perfectly pitched to his and delivered on his breath. By that transference, Robeson was multiply present, embodied, and accessible well beyond his immediate time and space. He was sought, conjured, and enlivened through sound and thought by poets, singers, and communities near and far. I think I'm just going to read one more paragraph, actually. An independence and civil rights movement spread throughout the colonial and African world. As independence and civil rights movements spread throughout the colonial and African world, Robeson developed a repertoire of sonic methods in order to be present there too, even in the absence of his right to travel. He understood that social movements are about feeling as much as cognition, sensing that others are with you even when you can't see them due to distance, incarceration, or even death. Robeson's sound migrations, the performances that allowed his detained or silenced voice to take flight, are indicative of a rising wind of Black internationalism and compel an investigation of the relationship between song and sight, fixity and enclosure, geography and citizenship. Through his practices of music making, Robeson's Black voice became what Alexander Wahilier elsewhere theorizes as, quote, a series of strategies and or techniques of corporeality, unquote, that allowed him to transcend and transgress physical and geopolitical borders as well as racial boundaries. The tortured and circuitous transfer of his voice through technologies of mobility, the body, amplification, and recording during the period of his US detention made anthems out of ballads and bodies out of oral fragments. In the process, Robeson was made manifest globally without travel, without consent, and without reservation. Let's stop there.
Okay. So the process that Gus and I have discussed is introducing one another, reading a selection that we've chosen from each other's projects, and then we'll return to reading selections that we want to share from our own projects a little bit farther along in the conversation. But I'm really pleased to be here. I want to echo all of Gus's thanks and congratulations for launching a project such as this. It's no small thing, I understand. Certainly just getting myself here was enough, let alone trying to ensure this organization. So thank you to everyone. And I was really pleased to be in conversation with Gus and thankful to you, Gus, for being willing to discuss this project in advance of folks being able to hold it in their hands. So hopefully I will do it some justice. Gus Stadler's Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life is a reintroduction to a hero who we've met but do not yet fully know. Recasting this iconic troubadour of the left is no easy task, as you might imagine. Biographies and think pieces of his life and legacy abound, his songs lionized on both sides of the Atlantic, his machine enshrined in a glorious curation of 20th century struggle. Yet, for all its accolades and altars, Guthrie's life, as it is known publicly and discursively, is bound by a critical absence that Stadler proves threatens to undo our knowledges of this person. Stadler accomplishes his intervention not by leveraging a shocking new discovery, breaking news, communist idol is gay, as so many others have done, but by drawing our attention to the understudied and rich creations that illuminate a reckoning with his first instrument, the one that caused him so much pleasure and pain, his body. This is the new terrain of knowledge that opens us to Guthrie's love of dance and dancers, his paintings and poems that are as lush as his songs, as well as his political rage against the capitalist institutionalization of care. For Stadler, Guthrie's periods of institutionalization are not salacious tales with which to bring a folk god down to human size, although there is in this task something helpful. Rather, he understands them as intensive periods of listening and experimentation by an artist who, in being disarticulated from his complicated body, has also been separated from the other art forms that reveal the deeply expressive and intimate forms of his political ideology. In lingering beautifully in those things unspoken and unpublished, Stadler reveals how Guthrie learned to live and imagine in and beyond a world in need of revolution on every scale. So I'm going to read a portion that I found particularly interesting. It's from the Look Away chapter towards the end of the book, which is situating his Southern White Notebook, as Gus calls it, which is a series of drawings and sketches and notes in which he really struggles with race in a very kind of visceral and poignant way. The material between the covers of the Southern White Notebook plays with nudity and spectacle too. But what is perhaps finally most startling about this strange, troubled document is that it won't or can't expunge the matter of whiteness. As noted, the phrases Southern white and white only appear on nearly every page, often scrawled in pencil, presumably after the production of the painted image. even when that image's relationship to racism is far from clear. The iterations of these phrases across the book leave the impression of someone compulsively speaking of and from whiteness, as if trapped inside it. The words appear in a way like stigmata, puncture wounds riddled with shame. Once again, there seems to be no pure space, no escape offered either viewer or audience, or artist, excuse me. Several of these images embody the overall feeling of inextricability. The nude bodies are trapped, enmeshed, tangled within and behind the knotted branches of Southern whiteness. They provide a visual echo of the way Guthrie described his own feelings of being wrapped up in shame and the shame that surrounds nakedness, whether literal nudity or that of a person openly airing their psychic wounds. As with so much of the material in this book, these images reflect an unfamiliar Woody Guthrie. There is no simple message here, no pat slogans indicating Southern white racism. The images are not topical or protest art in any familiar form. They look nothing like the art shown at the two major exhibitions of anti-lynching art mounted in New York City in 1935, one of them organized by Black communists. They don't uplift, they don't exhort. They don't even mourn, precisely. Indeed, unlike so much of the art with which Guthrie is famously associated, the response they seek from their audience is, especially by old left standards, opaque. The protest genre typically positions artist or singer and audience as outside the problem they address, not part of it. In contrast, Guthrie's images are not only unruly, they flirt with arousing a salacious response in their own viewers, implicating them in the very type of looking they are depicting. Like the look away image, this work is about looking, about the allure of sensational images. Rather than addressing the scourge of racial violence directly, the images focus on how it is mediated, on how representations of racial violence operate culturally. The images track these phenomena, not racism as a matter of individual conscience. It is likely less valuable to translate these works into a clear message than to understand them as documents of experience. In this case, the experience of a middle-aged Southern white man sitting with the implications of his past. So, I think the framing for this discussion today is a really interesting one. I don't know, Eric, if it ever became detuning biography or if it remains the less kind of, perhaps less provocative.
It is now detuning, and perhaps in
Okay.
the Journal of Popular Music Studies, you've given us the title.
Okay, great.
Everything's
I
a
think
work in process, right? That's our theme.
that's right, absolutely, just as this conversation. But I think the detuning element of it is a really interesting way to approach the conversation because, you know, I didn't set out to write a biography. I think, Gus, you had some sense of a biography in mind, perhaps, but what of that form and your book in relationship to it?
Well, I mean, as I said, you know, my books, it looks a lot more like a conventional biography than yours, Shana. And I was, the whole time I was working on the book, kind of wavering between whether this was going to be a more scholarly book or a trade book, and I thought it had potential in in both directions. And I ended up kind of just deciding I wanted to go for it with a trade press. You know, it's something I'd never done before, and that in itself kind of moved me more in the direction of, you know, a familiar form of biography with a narrative. But but I also wanted to bring forth this really different Woody Guthrie that I encountered when I got into the archive. And almost immediately I saw this other person there. And to me that meant, you know, finding focusing on a series of events that in the other biographies are not major events. So like his meeting his wife, who was a Martha Graham dancer, and his involvement with the New York dance world, or well, his writing about sex, and then his arrest on obscenity charges, and his time in a sex deviance clinic, and then his first extended period of hospitalization having to do with his Huntington's disease. And a big part of what I was trying to do was to counter, I think, this tendency in the biographies that are out there are 2 or 3, to see the part of his career in which he was starting to get sick as inevitably a kind of decline. And, it had impact on him. Huntington's is a very slow, the onset is very slow. And, you start to notice these little symptoms in your body of like little tremors and sometimes violent outbursts and things, but it takes years to really fully develop. So he was manifesting symptoms for a while, but it took a while to manifest itself fully. Anyway, I was trying to do the book in a way that sort of honored that period more when he was still working, but he was also sick. Because that's one of the things that the archive taught me, was that he was still working a lot. He was writing a lot of songs, doing a lot of painting, writing plays, all kinds of things. He had a lot of trouble getting them published, getting them recorded, and a lot of that has to do with his illness too. But I think, it's not, he wasn't completely under the control of his illness. And I think in some ways, the illness was something that was providing him with certain kinds of insight, actually, potentially even into something like race relations. And, just being in this position of, more and more in this position of like a disabled man, I think, made him think about politics in a different way too, a different way from like his old left investments in labor and the common man.
Yeah,
so anyway,
you draw that out really nicely, actually. I think that's part of what I really enjoyed about the chapter that I just read from was this being kind of a full onset period for his Huntington's, right? And him using this notebook as an opportunity to expand upon, kind of, his thinking about racial power, but through himself, and then also carrying through this line that's throughout the book around stigma and his railing against stigma in all various types of forms and scales, but the intimacy with which he felt it at that moment through his uncontrollable at times body, right? I thought was really compelling. I also liked how you start the book. So the opening scene where he's meeting his second wife, Marjorie, and is not able to keep proper time for the dancers, only really kind of hit me as a profound moment as I read the rest of the book, right? In recognition of its relationship to the disease. But I also was just really struck by it, even in that very moment of reading it in the early pages, because he was a musician, right? And he would often perform alone and acoustically, and, time is not as strict perhaps in those scenes. But I thought it was a really interesting way to open the book, this musician who was off time.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. And, I think as far as sort of my version of an alternate biography, I had been thinking about some of his writing about sexuality and this preoccupation with the body. And then I sort of tried to figure out what is the origin moment for that, where can I locate sort of him coming into this critical consciousness of the body. And it seemed to me that it was that moment when he meets Marjorie Mazia, the Martha Graham dancer, and and a number of other avant-garde dancers in Greenwich Village, and at the same time, he was writing about his mother's decline from Huntington's in his memoir, and just the kind of that image of him being around these really strong, powerful women and writing about the decline of his mother's body at the same time just seemed like such a kind of chilling but also generative moment from which to start this discussion of kind of like a different Guthrie than we know. Mm-hmm. But why don't I'd like to ask you too, what you as you were thinking about the book, what did it become clear, or did it become clear at some point that biography was just going to leave some certain things unspeakable? I'm not actually sure that you ever thought about writing a biography, but you must have been thinking about, because you knew people would read this in some way in relationship to that genre. Yeah. I'm just curious to hear what you felt was too constricting or limiting about the genre.
Yeah, no, I never intended to write a biography. In fact, I was telling Gus the other day that I didn't expect that I would ever return to Robeson, actually, after having included him in Anthem. He was, my favorite troubadour of that project. And so I knew he would forever be with me in a very material way, but I didn't intend ever to write about him over any significant scale. But I was doing work for other projects and out doing kind of interdisciplinary work, as we do, and going to exhibits and listening promiscuously. And he kept coming up in these weird forms and odd places. And one artist would lead me to another artist who was also referencing him. So Gus mentioned in the excerpt he read a poem in the book from Gwendolyn Brooks. There are a lot of poems in the book, actually, because that became a really foundational element of my archive. There are so many poets, June Jordan, Pablo Neruda, all of these individuals who wrote poems specifically dedicated to and about Robeson, as a means of kind of connecting him to the broader cosmos of which he was part and had so richly influenced. So the poets actually were some of the thinkers who most insisted that I actually take him seriously. So after some number of encounters with him where I was just kind of noting his presence, at a certain point I had to fully stop and say, there's something here. There's something that needs to be said. Why is he coming back? Why does he keep coming back in these ways? And especially for someone who's been so vilified, so erased, particularly at the hands of the federal government, it was a really unique opportunity for me to think about how the state fails. And I'm really into that. Like, I want to talk about how the state fails. And they failed to contain this person who has not only recurred in a number of artist treatments, a number of poetry writings, but also in the lore and archives of the Welsh nation, as you mentioned, Gus. So I went to Wales, and I'd imagine that he is best preserved anywhere in the world in Wales, right? That is the best preservation of his legacy and memory is in that country. And it's for that long-standing relationship that he had with the miners. So at a certain point, the evidence was just overwhelming. Something had to be done, but I knew I wasn't interested in a biography. I think part of what I'm less interested in with that form, as much as I rely on it, as many of them as I adore, what I'm less interested in is both the linearity of it. I don't want to tell a linear story. That's not how my mind works, but that's also not how I understand the world to work. Particularly in thinking about Black radicalisms, that there's always this back and forth that's happening, especially as the music demonstrates, right? It's not a procedural type of practice. So both the linearity of the biographical form, or at least as it's traditionally understood, and also in kind of the minutia that I think the discipline itself has insisted upon, minutia that while developing certain curiosities and interests may actually be less important than the way that they accumulate on a large scale and tell stories about power and intrigue and the futures of the world. And I think the best biographies actually do both of those things. They focus on the kind of granular level and the kind of canopy level. But I wanted to be able to tell the story as I wanted to tell it, and I don't think the biographical form always offers itself in that way. So having kind of workshopped the book at a couple of places, including with Barry, I saw you somewhere, Barry, it was clear to me that I needed to make some comment about biography in the introduction, and I explicitly say it's not a biography. If I were writing that sentence today, I think I'd say something different. I think I'd say that it's a non-biography, which is slightly different to me because it is telling the story of this person in ways that I think are really necessary and urgent and compelling. I don't think he can be contained by the biographical form, while at the same time, it's important that we learn some of these pieces of his life in order to tell these grander stories about the left, about radical internationalism, about our understanding of Black musical forms. So I would change that line if I were writing it today, but what I do say in the introduction that is still true is that Robeson is less subject than opportunity. He allows me to tell certain types of stories, not as a singular individual, but as a collective, that there are many, many people who actually shape his form and carry him well into the 21st century. And so that's what I'm curious about and interested in.
The reason that I read the passage of yours that I read, it was really hard to choose one, but I was really intrigued by the way that you talk about recording. So the chapter's about, it's about 3 locations of reception in which Robeson had an impact. So one's in Wales, one is Indonesia, and one is it's the Rangoon or Bandung.
Right.
Conference,
yeah. So it's
right.
Wales, Bandung, and then New York City after his death.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Anyway, so and in each of the he was not at any of these locations in a bodily present way. And it made me think a lot about like recording, how we talk about that word, and just in a way how narrowly we kind of use that word, just to refer to like records or essentially music as commodities, and there are other ways of conceiving of that process, that technology. And I mean, I just wondered if you had any more thoughts about Robeson's kind of detuning of recording too, or whatever. It's sort of like shifting of how we can think about that in relation to a musician.
Yeah, so that passage is from the first chapter, in which I'm trying to argue his holographic presence. So as Gus mentioned, the 3 scenes that I examine, he's not physically present in any of them. And so he's relying on various recording technologies, various communications technologies. And then in the final instance, he's relying in death on his memory and his kind of lingering vocal trace as a means of revivification. And, the language of hologram came to me in part through the descriptions of his voice, right? It's so singularly recognizable to anyone who's heard it. It could be no one else. And so in the instance in which you're hearing this voice that you know singularly to be this individual, what other types of affective ties are being developed in that moment? Because yes, it's about a history or a memory of that person, but it's also about the experience of sitting alongside that sound. And in hearing that sound, of course, vocalists are unlike other instrumentalists in many respects, one of which being that the instrument is the body. So if we're hearing this singular voice that we recognize as his, it means that we're hearing his body. And the holographic then is kind of a play on thinking about proximity and presence, even with such radical absence. So both of the first two scenes are set in the 1950s when his passport was revoked by the federal government, which meant that he could not travel beyond the contiguous United States, but was desperate to be next to the Wales miners, the Welsh miners in one case, and be present at the Bandung conference in the other scene. And so it was a really interesting opportunity to think about what technology was capable of, but what certain instruments are also capable of, and what kinds of animation were being developed on the other side of hearing, because part of the scene with the Welsh miners is made possible due to a recording that was made. This was a transatlantic phone call that was made that allowed for a conference between the miners of Stadler and Robeson in New York City as he was in his do-it-yourself studio. And so to have this recording of that exchange, those long pauses that, they feel long as we're listening to them, but are really only a few seconds long, but those pauses between the end of his voice and the applause from the miners and vice versa, gave me a lot to think about in trying to understand what the technology produces, what it does not, but also what difference embodiment makes in mediating those gaps, because there was already a filler there, already a connectivity. And having the president of the miners union write him back after that conference and said it was as if you were here with us, said everything to me about what intimacy is possible through those technologies, and how he best took advantage of it, even as he was so violently, detained in the United States. I mean, it's interesting to me in your work with Woody Guthrie, Gus, there is, quite a catalog of songs that you mention in the project, some number of which were not recorded, as you mentioned, due to his physical condition, due also to the content of some of those songs in response or in production during the second Red Scare. They just would have never had seen the light of day in that way. But I'm interested in how because you've written about technology quite a bit, recording technology, how you think about this project in relationship to that work, because now we're looking at these unpublished, unaired moments, right? So how do you kind of situate that performance, because it is a type of performance, inside of your thinking, your previous thinkings on recording technologies?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think when I was first working on the project, I was, struck by how relatively few recording sessions he had, and really like only 3 or 4 major ones, and one where he recorded like over 100 songs that provide, some huge percentage of the Guthrie songs that we have on CD and vinyl now. So it was a really different model from what we're used to now, the kind of regular routine recording. And there are all these songs in the archive like thousands of songs. And these are the songs from which Nora Guthrie, Woody's daughter, drew to give to Wilco and Billy Bragg and a lot of other musicians now, to write music for, because he didn't write down any music. Guthrie didn't write down any music. And when I was, first kind of thinking about that and looking at some of that material, just like, these aren't really songs. They're really just poems. Like there's no music, there's no chord chart or anything like that. And in a way, I really kind of came around on that actually. And just, I think there's a line in your book where you say something like, the song, I'm gonna twist this, but it's like the song was the form of his form and his mind's form, or something like that. Like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I can't recite it, but it was the shape of his. Yeah, exactly.
It's more poetically delivered than that. But I think that was true for him too. Like he saw things in terms of song. So when he wrote a song, he was probably hearing a melody. And then I started noticing how in a lot of the prose that you would suddenly start noticing rhyme and like kind of metric patterns. And like the first song on the first Mermaid Avenue Wilco Billy Bragg album, Walt Whitman's Niece, that's actually written out as prose. Like there are no line breaks, and it's totally metrical rhyming song. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit off of the topic of recording, but I mean, I think, when he didn't, and part of the reason that he wasn't recording much was because of the Red Scare, and then the other part was that he was ill. And I think, with that lack of opportunity meant that like songwriting itself was the form of recording that he was doing. And those were songs in there that, he didn't have a 4-track or whatever, or, that he could have done something like that.
And didn't even have his guitar so often, right?
Sometimes, when he was in the hospital, they wouldn't let him have his guitar. I guess I would sort of think about that as another sort of alternate form of recording, and not just think about them as like half-finished songs or whatever. Even though we can't hear what he was hearing. I mean, it would be amazing if we could hear what he was hearing, but
yeah, it's amazing to consider what transitions with these people, right? And I think that's part of what both of our books are kind of subtly addressing as well, are the many layers of loss that the people who remain are experiencing around the passing of this person. And because they're such public figures, because they're artists, right, that there are these long reaches that begin to actually then materialize affinities, familiarities, intimacies that the artists themselves could have never accounted for, right? Or would have likely not encouraged, but because we take them up in all of these really personal ways, they become something else. And I think that was part of my investment in thinking through form rather than time, as I talked about him in the book, because time was almost irrelevant. It was really about what shape he was taking, right? How was he being conjured? How was he being revived? Because that told me a lot, not only about him, but more than that, how he was being kept alive, how people were willing to remember and imagine themselves in the present through his shape, through his sound. So again, another reason why the biography just didn't work, because I wasn't telling his story alone. I was trying to tell a story about a political present, actually. And, you know, a biography of a political present would be a really interesting project, you know, had I conceived of it that way. But I think that the types of relations that these types of figures were able to manifest, and over so many generations, right, that they're literally developing disciples. Harry Belafonte identifies himself as a disciple of Paul Robeson, right? You think about Dylan and Guthrie, right? That there are all of these ways that we see these people coming back, subtly and not so subtly.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Guthrie never really got to experience his rise to this state of an icon. And sometimes when I was reading things, he would be in a despondent mood, and I would just feel so, you know, just sad.
Yeah.
That he, you know, would have no idea what would happen essentially, you know, after Dylan and that era's folk revival it would take to really lift his profile. And I think another thing that's interesting, and I guess maybe obvious to people about our projects, is both of these figures come from the same time, and in fact from the same circle of people of like popular front leftists. You know, I think within that time, Robeson was much better known than Woody Guthrie was.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he had a level of celebrity that was, well, you know, he'd been in Hollywood and all of that. He was in everything. He did everything, right?
Yeah,
he did everything.
He did.
So, I mean, that's sort of interesting too, the legacy question and how their legacies shape, you know, ended up, the shapes they ended up taking. And
how they ended their lives. I mean, you know, him struggling so valiantly with his disease, Robeson living the last 10 years of his life in obscurity, basically, yeah. Right? So I can't imagine, you know, living through that moment and reckoning with that moment in the ways that both of them would have had to do.
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting seeing, I saw you give a talk, or you were in a conversation with my colleague Asali Solomon at the Robeson House in Philadelphia a few months ago. I think like right before the pandemic, right? Yeah. It feels like the last
like
thing
a week before, yeah.
Outside of my house. And it was interesting, I think, because it was a different kind of crowd. It was, you know, there were some academics there, but it was largely not academics. This is in West Philly. And a lot of people were asking questions about sort of, you know, what is his relevance now? Or I think, or somebody even asked, like, what is his relevance to, like, you know, 52nd and Walnut or whatever, like, you know, or, you know, and what can we tell kids, you know, what would be useful to tell kids about him. And I mean, you answered in incredibly eloquent ways that I was in awe of, but, you know, I was wondering also, is that like something, I don't know, I guess, how do you feel when you're getting those questions? And is that something that your book has been kind of generating in other places for other sort of, you know, less academic audiences?
I've gotten that question a couple of times. I mean, I really only was able to touch down with the book in conversation a few times before the pandemic. So, you know, I haven't been, you know, fielding any emails or anything along those lines, but I did a daytime event before the Robeson House at Uncle Bobby's, and was asked a similar question actually by an educator who works in a school named for Paul Robeson, and the children walk by his image in the hallway every day and don't know who the hell he is. And there's no effort on the part of the school to actually display this person in anything more than that two-dimensional format hanging on the wall. So, you know, this question about how do we make him relevant for these newer generations, it is a tricky one on the one hand, because I don't want to be prescriptive around such things. I mean, I think part of the investment for me has to be about what he does for the person who will ultimately speak. And if there's someone, if he means something to you, then to share that with people will resonate on some form. But on the other hand, of course, it's also my belief that he will appear at some point, that people will cross paths with him. It's just about attuning folks to listen for those moments, right? So when you hear that song on a television program, or playing in the background of a film scene, or hear somebody in dialogue drop the name Robeson, have you done the work to understand what that is, what it might mean, how to situate it? So on the one hand, I think there's just a very practical need to teach about this person. He matters in so many different kinds of ways, even if it is just to document for people, how Black folks are treated in this country, right? And I think the present is illuminating that opportunity every single day. And there are many different ways of telling that story. But, because he was able to impact so many different parts of popular culture, of US and global culture, that there's no dearth of opportunities to tell his story. When Kaepernick happened, I wrote a short piece about him being an early NFL player and the legacy that Kaepernick is inheriting of, Robeson's relationship to athleticism and what it meant for his political career. There are all of these opportunities for him to be present. And I think the goal is really to attune people to the fact that he was here, and hope that they'll be curious enough to seek him out, or to hear him when he comes.
I mean, somewhat similarly, I mean, I'm really skeptical of leftists who say things like, "Oh, we really need a new Rudy Guthrie now." That's misguided. But there is some way, I think, at this moment, when the words socialism and anti-fascism are back in currency, that there's some, he's worth having out there, and in fact, somebody chalked the lyrics to "All You Fascists Bound to Lose" on the steps of the PMA during the protest, the first wave of protests, so it is interesting how these reputations change, and I think I have a couple different ideas about what might have happened if he'd lived. I think he would have not appreciated the sort of defanging of his music and just like a campfire type music, and the censorship of the private property verse and "This Land Is Your Land" and all of that.
Or the adoption of the song as the campaign song of Bush one.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, yeah, yeah. I just think it was interesting. I gave a talk about that chapter that you were reading from, Shana, that's about his reckoning with his whiteness, his past, and sort of his father having been likely involved with a really notorious lynching at the Guthrie Center one year, and Joe Klein, who wrote the first big biography of Guthrie, was in the audience. And he's, now he's a pretty well-known journalist. He wrote that novel Anonymous about the Clinton campaign, and he's kind of like a middle-of-the-road type guy. When he got up to do his talk, he said, directly addressing my talk, his talk was called Woody's People, and basically the argument was that Woody's people are now Trump voters. And then he directly said, I think talking about whiteness, white privilege, is a bad idea. You're only going to lose those voters if you keep those terms, like if you keep broadcasting terms like that, you're only going to alienate those voters. And I didn't get a chance to in the talk to respond to him, but then afterwards, he did come up to me, and I think he was like a sort of apologize or I don't know something, but I did say to him, you know, I don't think Woody Guthrie would ever have like blamed. Woody Guthrie or Woody Guthrie people would never have blamed their woes on like affirmative action or something. They would always blame it on capitalism. They would always blame it on corporate capitalism. Like there's, and or, they wouldn't blame it on like transgender people in the bathroom. They would blame it on capitalism. They're not Woody's people if they're not thinking like that. Mm-hmm. He was kind of like, yeah, maybe, something like that. It was not a long, but anyway.
I mean, if he's blaming Huntington's on capitalism, I don't think it's a stretch to believe that he would feel similarly about these more structural evidences of harm.
Right. So, I mean, I also hope, and, I hope, that there's some way that he represents some kind of possible wedge in, the politics of contemporary whiteness, and, and the culture wars and the ways those affect politics. And, I hope my book's reminding people about some of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's what I found so interesting about that entire chapter was seeing him be so self-referential in his understanding and kind of documentation of racial hierarchies. In ways that, I think we kind of assume about that generation of the left, but don't necessarily have as much material evidence of, at least in kind of common circulation. So I think that language of it actually makes a big difference. And I think it's interesting, Gus and I were talking about the fact that, as he mentioned, these two overlap significantly in time, right? Certainly in the similar political circles, but we don't know that they ever actually met, which is an interesting kind of question mark between these two, formidable figures of the old left. We know that they were both at Peekskill in 47, Robeson performing and Woody witnessing in terror what was happening at that site. But I'm really curious, maybe some more digging will produce that link where they one day shook hands. I can't imagine that didn't happen.
Yeah, many people in common between them. And I really think that event was a major event in his thinking about race and whiteness in particular. Just the terror of being attacked by a white mob, basically.
Yeah, it'll do it.
I wonder.
Do we want to move into questions or?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe this is a good time to sort of, as we come up on sort of the next hour, just break out and hear from, I think Carl's been monitoring some discussion in the chat room, and some of us have learned how to raise our hands on Zoom, which is not something I knew actually how to do before. Carl, do you want to sort of steer the ship here for a little?
Sure. Yeah, so two things. One, we were just working this out. If you want to raise your hand, figuratively speaking, if you click on the participants button at the bottom, there's a menu that'll pop up on the side of your screen that includes the option to raise your hand. And then I haven't seen that happen yet, so I'll see how easy it is for me to spot it. But the other thing, Eric, just before we move forward, is I don't think I can unmute people because I don't have host functions. So will you unmute people as I
think people can unmute themselves.
Okay, that's set that way? Okay, cool. So the first question I have up then is from Anne. So maybe she can speak.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me? I can't
Yes.
see myself. It's a little awkward. Gee, I was hoping you would read the question, Carl. I don't know what it was anymore. So Gosh, first I'll just say thank you. That was amazing and really helpful for me as someone who's working on a not biography, Shana, as you said, or an anti-biography or whatever it is. I really appreciate your words on that. I had a few different questions. I think the one Carl thinks I'm going to ask, which was the first one I posed for Gus, I'm going to sideline that because I have a question for both of you, which is thinking about the something you said, Gus, about how Woody Guthrie didn't have a 4-track, so we don't know if those were songs. And thinking about the ubiquity of the screen image of Paul Robeson and his connections to Hollywood, but at the same time, Shana, as you mentioned, the obscurity of his final years and his long exile. Are those realities the kind of journey into privacy, whether for reasons that were welcome or in both cases, I think, unwelcome? Is that even possible in the current age, and was it possible after the wider availability of recording technology, even before our current ubiquitous recording technology? In other words, is there something about technology that makes these two artists and as figures unique, and maybe not unique, but like bound to that historical moment, which we will never experience again? Their silence in those moments, or their privacy, or their relative inaccessibility, while they are also ubiquitous through resonance, as you say, if that makes sense.
I mean, just one thing that strikes me about that question is just a historical kind of thought in that. I mean, I think, a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of like Guthrie seeing everything through a song, and maybe hearing melodies that don't show up anywhere. I mean, I think that's part of the folk tradition in a way. And there aren't that many melodies anyway. Like, I mean, his songs only have like 5 melodies, and they're mostly ripped off from the Carter family. So, which is again, like an interesting kind of reproduction recording. And I'm wondering if this was kind of like a hybrid moment in a way, where that older tradition of recording, that's private in a way, but it's also collective, is coming up against, or with, is sort of building a web with these new electronic technologies that are, I mean, they've been around for a while, but they're becoming much more advanced in their fidelity, and the market's getting much bigger and everything. So I don't know. I mean, in terms of whether it's, you're sort of asking, do we lose some access to something private? I can't.
Sorry. Speaking of technology, no, not so much that we lose access to something, but just like the way we think about artists who left us before they could have possibly made home recordings. You know what I mean? Versus those who say from the 60s onward, really from the moment of Woody Guthrie's death onward, almost, things change, and then Shana, I think, that the shocking absence of Robeson that you're talking about, of knowledge of him, would that, I mean, I don't know, this is a weird way to say it, but like, if there were a Robeson-like figure now, could he have had a vlog in exile and spoken to us, and then never truly been in exile in the same way? I don't know. It's just playful thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think he did record throughout the 1950s from a makeshift studio in New York after all contracts were canceled with Columbia and all of the major labels. I mean, I think for him, it's less for me about the influence of technology than it is about the influence of the industry. There are many, many recordings that actually have come out in the 70s and even into the 80s. So that even the Porthcawl, the Welsh transatlantic concert that I write about and mentioned, that recording came out in 2007, right? So his voice continues to be produced in ways that are more accessible to people, but it has a lot more to do with what the industry has decided upon than what he was agentive in having recorded or conceived of himself, right? So those 1950 recordings under the imprint of Othello Records, there are some amazing recordings that he was able to put out himself, but then you have this kind of abundance in some cases of compilations that these industry labels, which had blacklisted him, cut his contracts, then produce after he dies, because they recognize, of course, that there's currency and value in that. So I think the industry for him has played a bigger role, perhaps, in the silence or presence of his voice than the technology itself. But I think were there to be someone of this generation who was somewhat similarly positioned politically and had gone into exile, I think just the lure of social media would complicate that relationship to exile, right? You think about someone like, you know, not at all a one-to-one, but a Dave Chappelle or even a Mos Def, these people who go into short-term, longer-term exile on the continent and are, you know, sending up remote kind of signals of I'm still here, dropping a single here, there. There is a different type of control that they're able to manifest over their own timeline in relationship to the public that was not at all the same for him. But of course, they have an entire kind of apparatus around them, right? Even if it is one of their singular creation in this moment of infamy. So I do think the technology then plays a significant role in making them available to us, but the industry does too.
Thank you.
Made it. My inclination is to call on people instead of reading their questions out, but if I don't hear back from you, then I'll read the question out. But yeah, we had a question from John Shaw. John, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Gus and Shana. Wonderful presentations. I'm eager to read the books. Shana was really, the linearity of biography. Yes, I was really, I really resonated with that observation. One of the things I came across several years ago was Benedict Anderson's, in his book on nationalism, his observation that in the 18th century, when newspapers started emerging, the novel emerged at a really similar time, and both the novel and the newspaper have a sense of meanwhile, which biographies tend not to have. So in a way, the biography is a pre-modern genre form in that respect. So anyway, that's just wanted to, that just struck me. I have a couple questions for Gus. I was really happy to hear your emphasis on his interest in dancing. He wrote a lot about it and sang a lot about dancing, and he played dances. But I just had a couple biographical questions that have been haunting me, and I was wondering if you'd track them down. One of them is whether Marjorie's children and grandchildren have any relationship with Mary's grandchildren, whether Mary's grandchildren are benefiting at all from Guthrie's still productive copyrights.
I mean, definitely don't quote me on this, but I think they do. I think they have social interactions. My contact with the family has been, you know, I've had meals with them a couple of times and whatever, overheard things. And I feel like that's my impression. You know, they definitely, I mean, Guthrie's, his first wife, the kids from the first wife and the kids with Marjorie definitely mixed. Guthrie was particularly fond of his daughter I can't remember her name right now, from his first marriage. And
Gwen.
She Gwen, thank you. She came when they moved to Coney Island, she came and helped Woody paint the front of the local Communist Party office, which is right down the block from their house. Which is a very sweet story. So yeah, I know that there was, he made an effort to stay in touch with them and visit them, and sometimes reciprocate.
Okay, I was just wondering. So wondering if you'd come across. If it's time for a second question.
Maybe I think we should move on because we don't have too much time, and there are people lined up. Thank you.
Great.
Franklin Bruno had a question next. Franklin, are you there? Okay, maybe I will read his question.
Here, Franklin.
He just does unmute yourself, Franklin.
Yes, now?
Yep.
Okay. So both of these are fascinating projects. Obviously rich figures to write about who are both at the center of many complicated things, and I'd love to be able to ask both of you a bunch of things. But just for Shana, one really fact. I mean, I've noticed this thing that you say about there's so many compilations. I have, probably 6 or 7 different Robeson CDs that have a lot of overlap, and I'll see something. I think, do I need that one? So I was wondering, just for sort of research purposes, is there anything like a good discography or sessionography of Robeson at this point, like a place to look to figure out when different things are from and where you can find them? But the more substantial question is, so Paul Robeson, sort of famously a polymath, but not largely a composer or songwriter. He depended on others for material, including, found and arranged. I don't know to what degree the arrangements sort of issue from him, global folk songs, but also worked with a range of songwriters, both commercially and less commercially, from Earl Robinson and John Latouche on Ballad for Americans, to there's this kind of famous relationship with Old Man River and how he changed it, and Mark Blitzstein, and figures of the left, figures not so much of the left, etc. So since you are writing a book that you said is not about him but about a community around him, I wonder how you figure Robeson as a collaborator, like what role he took in finding the material, shaping the material, choosing, rejecting, all of that. So that's the area kind of I'm interested in what you're thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. I talk a little bit more about some of his broader, some of the music that was being sent to him by lesser known musicians, particularly folks from Eastern Europe, from Russia. I talk a little bit about that in the chapter in Anthem. I talk less about that in this book. But obviously the whole project is thinking about collaboration, whether or not he was agentive in that collaboration or not. But the longest durational collaboration of his musical life was with his accompanist, Lawrence Brown, who was a fantastic ethnographer and arranger of Black folk song. And obviously he also had a relationship to the musics of Harry T. Burleigh, whom he also knew and worked with. So I do some of that situational work around his catalog in the Anthem chapter. But one of the things that I draw out in the chapter that I titled Play is thinking about rehearsal and its significance in his longevity, the longevity of his voice, right? Having literally sung for 40 years, but also the endurance that he was able to build over his lifetime as a figure, as a champion of certain communities. So there's a theoretical element of rehearsal that I'm bringing to bear on what I might call that collaborative practice as well. But I think the kind of fine details between various people is a really interesting one, particularly composers. I do some of that with some of the poetry that I use in the book. Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, that becomes a big archival source for me, is the poetry, and some number of them that I quote in the book are not by authors who are published or widely recognized. So there's definitely that relationship, but again, he may not have lived to see that collaboration. He's now being spoken to by this whole other generation of artists and activists. But as far as kind of a black and white documentary type document of his discography, there's actually a really interesting, helpful one that is on the University of Chicago website, buried somewhere in their Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. If you email me, I'll send you the link for it. It was helpful for me. It shows the number of times certain songs were recorded and gives some comprehensivity to his discography.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful.
Sarah Marcus, you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. This is such a fantastic discussion. I'm so glad that it's happening. That my question, I'll actually just read what I typed in the chat. I was really struck, Shana, in your voice by the way that you're theorizing absence, shapeshifting, waiting, which you mentioned so marvelously, especially at the end, this idea of sonic things, and specifically of voice and capital V voice as a resource or a presence that lingers and that can wait for people to take it up in various forms. So my question for you, and this is sort of I have like two sides of a question for each of you. The question for Shana is just if you want to expand a little bit more on the figure of the capital V voice that you get into in your book and that's so central there. And then my question for Gus would be whether you think that Guthrie's persistence as an icon has a similar or different relationship to vocality than Robeson. Like, is it similarly through voice, small or big V, that Guthrie survives, or is there another figure that had started to seem apt for you in talking about Guthrie's ongoing cultural presence?
Thank you for that. So my investment in thinking through the voice capital V is trying to actually bring a different analytic to our studies of vocal performances, right? That they are actually about the form and the function, which is the, surtitle of the book. So often we have folks who kind of place emphasis on one or the other. And my argument in the book is that by looking at a figure like Robeson, we're able to actually examine both really robustly and understand their interreliance, that the form and shape of his voice, these compositions, the close analytical readings that we're able to bring to tone and timbre and all of these other evidences of his skill as a performer does not exist outside of the function to which his voice was put. The whole reason that he was singing was in order to actually commune with, struggle alongside, encourage people around him. And so for a figure like him, you can't absent one or the other. And my experience in reading the historiography has been that it's mostly the form that's been sacrificed. His work as a vocalist has been under-theorized in the historiography of his life. He's been kind of taken up significantly by a labor left, right, for rightful reason, right? It makes sense that that would happen, but in the process, they've forgotten or withheld an opportunity for audiences to actually know how he made himself present, and it was first and foremost through his voice. So I wanted to really insist on the fact that he was a singer, and to take that very, very seriously as he took it, right? Which was not kind of a passing fancy. It was not the edutainment portion of the rally or the march or the protest. It was actually the reason for being there. It was the point. It was the conversation for him because it carried with it so many genealogies, so many means and methods of thought and performance, and its impact was something that was felt locally, nationally, and internationally. So the capital V, as awkward as it sometimes may seem in the sentence structure, in the syntax, is actually just a way to insist on the fact that all of these things are collaborating through his body and through his thinking at the same time.
in Guthrie's case, I'm thinking about, yeah. I mean, certainly, you know, in this very, you know, obvious way, his singing influenced Dylan's singing, at least for a time. And, you know, there's something about, there was something seductive enough in his voice that like this kid from Minnesota wanted to copy him and you know, use that as a springboard to become the biggest folk musician in the world. And actually the family was actually kind of freaked out by that, by Dylan's imitation, what they considered sort of swapping from, stealing from Guthrie, and even they thought that he was stealing from, in particular, some of the gestures that had emerged with the Huntingtons, some of the jerky stuff, and you know, vocal patterns of like, you know, little eruptions or interruptions or shakiness. So for a time they were actually kind of angry about that. But you know, I'm trying to think about more in a more contemporary way. You know, I don't think. I mean, Shana's book really actually helps me think about this. But you know, I think, you know, Shana does this great job of depicting how the capital V voice like involves the conjuring of this complete sense of presence, and that you can't sort of distribute the senses into their normally kind of balkanized, separate zones. You know, his body's there when you hear him, you know. And I don't think Guthrie's voice leads the same way that Robeson's does, but at the same time, you know, I just think of like, so the most iconic image of him is the, you know, "This machine kills fascists" image, like, you know, widely reproduced on T-shirts, etc. And I mean, there is something about that image that sings. You know, I mean, I feel like it's an example of like a kind of multi-sensory image. Their words, it's a striking, like, kind of gorilla pose. You know, there's a guitar there. I mean, there's sort of like these signifiers of sound, of language, and of the body there in a very dramatic position. So I don't know. I don't think it's just the voice so much as the voice within this kind of constellation of things for his legacy. I mean, other people might think differently. I have a feeling many more people would recognize Paul Robeson's voice today than they would recognize Woody Guthrie's voice, to be honest.
I think that has something to do with the catalog too. I think there's a different repetition for spirituals and things than some of the more traditionally favored and held left folk songs, right? Even if we think about choral arrangements that are taking up the spirituals and keeping them in circulation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think we have time for just one last quickish question. I thought Scott Saul had a question that kind of brought everything together as a kind of a nice little curly Q at the end. So maybe he can ask that.
I'll try to do that. My mind's kind of reeling over what Gus just said about the Woody Guthrie family, you know, being so freaked out about Dylan's possible parodying of his late voice. Great. I'm here with my wife, Alana, by the way. She's enjoying it too. I love this series. It's a great thing.
Thanks, Scott.
It helped me in my pandemic time. So my question was about how this makes us rethink the culture of the left, or particularly the old left from, like, you know, the 30s to the 50s. It seems like both of them are really about, like, you know, amplifying aspects of their their lives or their work. You know, Guthrie's wrestling with disability, or which I was just saying about thinking, really listening to his voice and not just thinking about the kind of labor left coalition he brought forward that haven't really been part of these previous accounts. And so my question is like, is this because the culture of the left had a blind spot on these scores, i.e., you know, either, you know, they didn't appreciate the importance of voice, or they didn't think as much about disability because they were always putting images of burly white factory workers in their iconography? Or is that critics and biographers have left this stuff out because they weren't attuned to what was really going on? And so for the question with Woody Guthrie and disability, was there, you know, in other parts of the left an appreciation that, like, you know, people who are most likely to be, you know, on the outs of capitalism are the people with disabilities, the people who have been maimed in the course of working in a factory or otherwise, you know, had some issues, you know, with our kind of healthcare system. And so that was my general question, you know, throw back out to you guys.
That's a great question.
I mean, I think just blanketly, culture is still undervalued in these histories, unfortunately. And, you know, part of my investment and basically what I've staked my career on is the fact that music is an organizing tool, right? It's a strategy. And I think it's been underdeveloped as such in the literatures, particularly of these broader scale internationalist leftist collectives. There's been, you know, some really valiant and amazing and necessary work done towards that, but it's still underutilized, under-recognized. So there's that. I think with someone like Robeson, because he was also doing the tandem work of public speaking, of killing HUAC in his 2 appearances before the committee, right? I think that it's easy for them to kind of take that more straightforward route toward rhetorics and political positionality, rather than actually doing the close listening that his catalog requires, right? To think about the consistency of his beliefs as being documented in the song, not in his public speaking necessarily, because he was a student. He was constantly in study. The rhetorics that you find there, while pretty consistent, are not going to be as consistent as what his catalog reveals. So I think because he was doing both of those things at the same time, because he was also working in, you know, kind of sequestered cells of the CP and things like that, people are willing to focus on that rather than on the talent that actually brought him to the attention of these organizations and communities in the first place, even as they very much relied on that popularity for the message they knew he was able to bring. So it's this interesting avowal, disavowal. We want you as a popular entertainer, but we're going to dismiss the song. We only want to actually talk about the message as you presented in a very traditional sense. So again, I think because he could do everything, it kind of allows people to ignore those moments where you have to retool and retrain your practices for political investment and your understanding of political ideology.
And I have somewhat different, I guess it's not contradicting, but different response in a different vein, which is, you know, I guess my ideas were really impacted by Michael Denning's work on the cultural front, and, you know, sort of his emphasis on the role of culture in the popular front. But then beyond that, I was really impacted by a book called Bohemian Los Angeles by Daniel Hurwitz, a historian, I think, from CUNY. And, you know, he makes this argument, it's centered on this neighborhood in LA called Edendale, which I think is now like partly Silver Lake and partly something else. But it was this bohemian neighborhood where a lot of communists lived, a lot of queers lived, a lot of just like artists, kinds of bohemians lived in the 30s. And he uses it as this example of a kind of, a little lab dish or whatever, like in which a left that's an old left that's not as like strictly masculine, as strictly like labor oriented, that values cultural expression, self-expression, was developing. And I kind of, and Guthrie lived in Los Angeles in the late 30s, and he also met his best friend Will Geer there, who was gay, so that kind of primed me to look for evidence of like similar phenomena in other places, and I think The Village was something like that. But I did start reading, like I think I actually talked about this at PopCon one year. I read a novel by a Popular Front novelist named Jo Sinclair, a female novelist, which is this really weird novel about a guy, this really depressed Jewish man who's, with his name has been changed to something less Jewish, and who is in psychotherapy, and he spends a lot of time talking to his sister, who's a lesbian, after sessions, and from his sister, he learns from his sister this whole kind of theory of what she calls social wounds, and she uses that term to cover like racial harassment, homophobia, disability. Like she talks about identifying with somebody who's crippled, and it's this kind of. It was when I read that, I was sort of like, this seems like the emergence of something different, like a politics that's about stigma, that sees this currency of stigma that crosses these different identities, and they're not necessarily the same, but there's something that allows them to be talked about in the same way. And I think Guthrie was part of that too. Like I think he was one of the early instances of that too, and he was just really obsessed with shame and being shamed in all these different ways, that intensified with his illness. And you can see in that sort of very early seeds of like pride politics or something like that. But also I think of this more kind of just liberal like prejudice as a general category, so I found that really, really interesting, and it also made me think there's a richer story to be told here. I don't know how to periodize it. I don't know if like you want to say it starts in the mid 40s or something. It wasn't true before that, but there's definitely more to be done. I think Richard Wright's The Outsider is also a novel that's useful for this. There's a conversation between a disabled man and the Black protagonist in that that's really interesting. So yeah, I'm actually interested in exploring that a lot more, like sort of those years 45 to 50 and the emergence of this kind of discourse around stigma.
I think, hey folks, I think we have to stop there, although this has been fantastic, an amazing start to the series. I want to thank everyone who's stuck it out till now because you couldn't leave. And can we all just like put our hands together, muted or unmuted, for Gus and Shana? Amazingly, Shana's about to go off and then be in dialogue with Vijay Iyer. She's just the generosity of these two doing this tonight and getting us started is so tremendous. I really appreciate it, you guys. Carl, thank you for steering the Q&A. Please send feedback. I'm going to try to preserve this recording and also the transcript of the questions. So I'll do my best with all this stuff because it was all incredibly rich, and I feel like we are all ready to write the new history of the left in popular culture in a fashion that hasn't been done yet. So thanks to everybody. Next week, Faith Pennick is going to be here talking about D'Angelo's Voodoo from the 33 1/3 book she's written. So a different lens to come at this subject. Come as often as you can, tell others, and let me know what you thought, okay? Good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.